Let's get to the main story of the day. South Africa has opened proceedings against Israel in the International Court of Justice and has laid out in an incredibly well-formed way the intentional and consistent attempt to conduct a genocide, specifically in Gaza, but increasingly also in the West Bank too. We're going to take a little look at it. In many ways, it's no surprise that South Africa has led this charge. So it is South Africa that has filed the court case in The Hague and has kind of made the accusation that Israel is undertaking a genocide. And if you look into any kind of issues of global injustice, you will very often find that South Africa is involved in fighting on behalf of countries in the global south, poorer countries, disempowered countries. South Africa doesn't get everything right. It's had the same government for like decades at this point. Whatever the political policies of the ANC, being in power for that long leads to a slightly moribund politics. It opens the door to all kinds of corruption and all sorts. Not having that shake-up every so often can be a really negative force. So for those of you that don't know, Palestine is kind of split between the Gaza Strip, which is where this invasion has happened and a lot of the bombing is happening. And then there's the West Bank here. And the West Bank is where a lot of the like illegal settlements are. When you hear people talk about illegal settlements in Palestine, what's essentially happened is that the Israeli government has supported citizens in kind of taking over homes here and setting up little villages, etc. Whereas they have, until this year, withdrawn entirely from the Gaza Strip. And what's happened over recent months is, as well as the IDF coming and invading in Gaza, settlers in the West Bank have essentially been doing like, I don't know, vigilantism's maybe not the right word, like terrorism essentially, right? People who maybe aren't necessarily members of the IDF but are armed settlers have been going out and just killing their neighbors. So I don't know if the polling has changed recently, but in the aftermath of Hamas's attack in October, there was real anger at Netanyahu and his government because they've been focusing a huge amount on setting up these settlements in the West Bank, which, because you're either taking over people's homes or you're evicting Palestinians out of their homes and handing the keys to an Israeli, whether they've been an Israeli for a very long time or whether they have just arrived from the US, because you're doing that, or you're setting up a settlement of some description that needs defense and support for people to feel safe there. And so they had committed a huge amount of resource in terms of the army to establishing settlements in the West Bank, which left the border to Gaza kind of underprotected, as it were, which is why there's been a lot of anger within Israel at Netanyahu and his government, because this kind of project of further colonizing the West Bank has led to a situation where that could happen. So as I understand it, it's kind of a two-part process. The potential is that it works in similar ways to civil court cases where you can apply for the thing that is happening to stop in order that you can have a proper case about it. It is likely, or it is hoped, that there would be a ruling which either would or wouldn't instruct Israel to stop, and that could happen in relatively short order. However, the decision on whether or not it is officially classified as a genocide is likely to take like years. The hope in the kind of short term is that the ICJ might order Israel to stop what it's doing. The follow-on question being whether that is likely to actually have an impact, because Israel can kind of just ignore it if they want and would be likely to do so. And then the next step from that would be the ICJ instructing the UN Security Council to step in. But again, what they can do is just not do that. A lot of our international politics are kind of based on kind of diplomacy as much as anything. Most kind of rules around like war crimes and stuff, in the short term at least, are based on hoping people don't want to be thought of as war criminals. Further down the line, the International Criminal Court can kind of take action on that stuff, but the rules-based international order is less about there being punishment for breaking the rules and more about vibes, I guess. We have seen international support begin to falter massively, but it's to what length does that go? the reality of it is does the money stop flowing? That will be the big decider. Okay, so South Africa wants the ICJ to order Israel to immediately suspend its military operations in and against Gaza. But it is virtually certain Israel would disregard such an order and could not be made to comply. As is the case with pretty much any international institution like this, which sounds really serious on the surface, rulings are theoretically legally binding on parties to the ICJ, which includes Israel and South Africa, but in practice, unenforceable. In 2022, the ICJ ordered Russia to immediately suspend military operations in Ukraine, but the order was ignored. Oh, okay, so it says that the ICJ can potentially order Israel to stop quickly, but whether or not the case ends with Israel's actions being ruled a genocide could take much longer, which is often the case with any big court case, let alone one surrounding genocide. This fascinating, the parallels in terms of invasion and occupation between Ukraine and Palestine, and the ways in which, in the UK at least, kind of the ways in which the media talks about those things, and in which politicians and commentators who are seen as legitimate, reputable figures talk about those things, are as though they are very, very different, when in reality support for one should, on principle, necessitate support for the other. If we want there to be some sort of system of, not even international order, because, we know that is a bit of a pipe dream maybe, but if we want countries to be worried about committing war crimes because they're going to get punished for it, then, the politicians and figures that are willing to sort of stand back and let Israel do what Israel is doing, loses them a huge amount of credibility when they want to criticize Putin for doing very similar things. So this has been one of my things throughout this, is the ways in which the British media and British political commentators have reported on Gaza has often had me feeling like I should be doubting my views on it, because in the UK press, and therefore in what is kind of perceived to be political conversation in the UK, because that is mediated through the press, right? Solidarity with the people of Gaza and the West Bank, Palestine more generally, has almost been framed as kind of unconscionable and irrational. That support for a ceasefire has almost in itself been framed as almost a kind of violent act, right? And then every so often I'll be like, I'll take a look on Twitter or whatever and see what's being said elsewhere in the world. I find myself just reading the reflections of people from Médecins Sans Frontières or the World Health Organization, all of whom are also calling for ceasefires, right? And you suddenly find that all these people in these institutions that you are meant to respect are all also calling for a ceasefire, and suddenly I found that's had to have been the thing that's made me feel sane again, because just listening to UK news has often made that feel like a really irrational view to have.